Good morning and welcome to the third of our sessions in Rome from Founding Legends to Mistress of the Mediterranean. This cover slide shows the story of Camillus and the schoolmaster. The various 17th and 18th century paintings that I looked at and considered for the slide were not actually very good in my view, so I used my artificial intelligence engine to generate one for me, and what you have is probably closer to what happened than the earlier paintings show. Those schoolboys look particularly monstrous, don't they? But what they did was probably pretty monstrous as well. And the schoolmaster looks a little nobler than he probably was, but you can certainly see that he's been badly beaten about by those boys. We'll come to the story of Camillus and the schoolmaster. Whether it happened, as ever, is open to very serious doubts. But what we cannot doubt is that this is something that was told to generation after generation of Roman schoolboys, and is something that had some influence on how the Romans behaved in their dealings with foreigners. Let's begin with this timeline of Roman expansion, and I start in the mythical year 509 BC when the Republic was established, going down to 264 BC, which is a hard date. It's a certain date. It is the date when the first war with Carthage broke out. During that period, all of Roman expansion was within Italy. It was within the peninsula of Italy, excluding Sicily and the islands. And here is an approximate timeline of Roman expansion. So it begins in 508, going down to 396, with the conquest of Latium. And Latium can be taken as that red area on the map. You can see Rome to the north of it, and the red area goes down all the way to Capua. These are, broadly speaking, the Latin-speaking areas of Italy. You can see that this progress of expansion was interrupted, very briefly interrupted, but embarrassingly interrupted, and importantly interrupted as well, by the sack of Rome by the Gauls in 390 BC. Then between 343 and 341 you have the first Samnite War, where the Romans took over this orangey areas of the peninsula, Spoleto and Benevento for example. 326 the Latin War, 298 to 290 the second Samnite War, 282 to 272 the Pyrrhic War, which I will discuss, 272 the capture of Tarentum, which is in the south of the peninsula, and that pretty well completes the Roman conquest of Italy. Something worth discussing is, why did the Romans set about the conquest of Italy? Good question. The answer is not something specific to the Romans, it is something rather general. You might ask, how did the British control, or why did the British conquer about a third of the Earth's surface? Why does any empire expand? One answer is love of conquest. Something rather unpleasant about our nature is that we enjoy killing each other, and we enjoy taking each other's things, and the conquest of Italy allowed the Romans many opportunities for killing people and many opportunities for taking things away from other people. You can conquer an empire simply because you're a rather unpleasant group of people who particularly like killing and stealing, or you can conquer an empire because you believe that you are a superior people, peculiarly fitted to conquer and to rule other peoples. You can regard this as perhaps a deplorable belief, but it is a belief which has driven many people. But possibly The main reason for the expansion of Roman control over Italy, just as the main reason for the expansion of any other empire in history, is the simple needs of defence. One of the reasons why the Romans conquered the nearby cities was to stop them from being a threat to Rome. If you control all of the local cities, it means that no longer will little armies be marching out to come and burn your fields and take your things and to drive off your cattle. But once you've conquered all the neighbouring cities, and once these are under a reasonably firm and fair system of Roman control, you then find that people beyond your borders are now making incursions. Or you may find that they have something that you particularly want, like control of a river or something of that nature. And so you conquer that area and you absorb it. And then once that's been firmly established, you find that you have another border, an enlarged border, with enemies beyond that who do come in and take your things, or who may be inclined at some point in the future to come and take your things. And so you begin the process of conquest and expansion over again, which brings a degree of security to the territories that you control, except of course that there is now another frontier which is further expanded, but beyond that frontier there are outsiders, and they are, or they may be, inclined to come across and to take your things. And so you keep on and on expanding. And that explains how eventually the Romans expanded their area of control or their empire all the way up to those hard borders, the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, and the Sahara Desert. Beyond those areas, it was not convenient to progress, and it was possible for the first time to establish clear and secure frontiers between the area that you control and the areas from which other people may be inclined to break in and to steal your things. This is a process that began very early in Roman history, and it's one that continued throughout. So there is a map showing the gradual absorption of the whole of Italy into a Roman, shall we call it an empire, or shall we call it a confederation? No, let's just call it a zone of control at the moment. It shows the progressive conquest or the progressive absorption of Italy into Roman control. And it's a long-term process. It goes on between 509 and 264. Many of the details are fictitious because we don't really know what happened before 390 BC. But after 390 BC, there may be a degree of bias in the Roman histories, but at least we are dealing with reasonably established facts. But both before and after 390, you do have a continuous process of conquest and of absorption. I will say as well that not all of this absorption of Italy came about through actual conquest, laying siege to cities, breaking in, killing people, looting, burning, doing all the usual military things. Quite often it was a peaceful process where the Romans made alliances with neighbouring cities or alliances with more distant places, alliances of friendship and mutual defence, which gradually matured into something like a common nationality. Unlike the Athenians, unlike the Spartans, unlike any of the Greeks, the Romans were always generous, judiciously generous, not indiscriminate, but the Romans were always generous with grants of Roman citizenship. It was extremely difficult to become an Athenian citizen because Athenian citizenship was something that emerged from birth into a particular Athenian clan, And if you hadn't been born into one of those clans, it was not impossible, but it was extremely difficult for a foreigner to be accepted as an Athenian citizen. Indeed, in Athens, throughout its entire period as an independent power, you had a very large group of people called metics. These were resident aliens, and these were not foreigners who drifted into Athens and who lived there for a while. These were very often the sons, the grandchildren, the great-great-grandchildren, the great-great-great-grandchildren of people who'd settled in Athens in the past, but because they couldn't show descent from anybody within the clans of Athenian society, they were not citizens and could not become citizens. At a very early time in their history, the Romans made a clear legal distinction between birth membership of Roman society and Roman citizenship itself. And so it was possible for the Romans to hand out grants of citizenship to whole communities or just to individuals within those communities. And this, of course, had a significant effect on the expansion of Roman power. Very often, the Romans did not conquer other peoples, take them over and say, "We are Romans, you are foreigners, and we are now the bosses." Very often, the Romans would conquer or they would absorb a territory, and then they would hand out Roman citizenship so that after 50 or 100 years, the people in that new territory would regard themselves as Romans, and they would look back to the great early days of Roman history as if it were their own history. You see this in large parts of Italy, and you see it progressively throughout the empire that they conquered, so that St. Paul had not been to Rome until quite close to the end, but he was a Roman citizen because it seems his grandfather had been given Roman citizen by Pompey the Great 80 years earlier when he swept through the east, stabilizing it and absorbing parts of it into the Roman Empire. That is the growth of Roman power in Italy. I don't want to spend too much time on the details of the conquest of Latium, that is that reddish area centred on Rome, largely because it is mythical and largely because it is an account of battle after battle after battle. Battles in themselves are not enormously interesting as far as I'm concerned. They have an occasional interest, but I don't share the obsession of ancient historians with the minutiae of how the left column swept down and saved the right column, which was under attack by someone else's cavalry. I have grim memories of reading books 1 and 2 of Caesar's Gallic Wars when I was a boy. But the other reason I don't want to spend too much time on it is that it is largely mythical. What we can say, though, is that whether mythical or true, it is an account of how the Romans often responded to external attacks, or at least to external threats, how they took over a particular territory and settled it, and then how this new expanded territory came under actual or potential threats from beyond the new frontier. It also illustrates the process of Roman conquest and Roman absorption. As I said earlier, sometimes the Romans would conquer a territory and they would rule it as a conquered territory. Very often, though, especially when the conquered peoples or the neighbouring peoples spoke Latin or a language very close to Latin, the Romans would absorb them, and I'm using the word absorb in a rather general sense. The Romans would absorb them and then give them Roman citizenship, which gave them all the rights of Roman citizenship. So there is the gradual conquest of Latium, or that red area to the north and the south and the east of Rome. Let's now come to one of the great Romans who may have existed, indeed who probably did exist. This is a story from 408 BC, which is within 20 years of the Gallic Sack of Rome, and so for that reason alone we can assume that it is a broadly true story. Its details may have been coloured somewhat by later historians. Some elements of the story may have been fitted after the event, but we can take this as, broadly speaking, an event of true Roman history. And so it is true, and it's also useful to illustrate how the Romans saw themselves as they were, and how the Romans believed that they should be. In 458 BC, somewhat earlier than the headline in the slide, I'll change that. 458 BC, Rome was in danger of losing a war against the Aequi. They were an external people in Italy. They were not in the area of Roman control, and they had attacked the allies of Rome. The Romans went to the defence of their allies, and they found themselves overwhelmed, and it looked for a while as though this large and hostile people, the Aequi, would sweep into Latium, and they would even take Rome. Rome was in sudden grave danger. I'll show you the constitution of the Roman Republic in a moment. I did show it to you last week, although I think it's relevant to show it to you now. There it is. There is the constitution of the Roman Republic. I'll emphasize yet again, it was always a work in progress, and this does not necessarily describe the Republic at any particular time in its development, but this is the general outlines. It is a balanced system of government which includes elements of monarchy, of aristocracy, and of democracy. It's a system which for the most part worked very well. There was, however, a provision in this constitution which is not shown on the diagram. There was a provision in the Roman constitution so that if the state was in very serious danger, and if the ordinary machinery of government was not adequate for dealing with that danger, the Senate, with some input by the assembly, which I won't describe, it was possible for the Senate to appoint a dictator. This was somebody who would hold office for 6 months, and during that time would have absolutely unlimited and unaccountable power over all Roman life and property. The job of the dictator was to save the state. At the end of 6 months, presumably the danger would have been overcome, and then the dictator would resign his office and return to ordinary life. There was a provision for extending that dictatorship as required, and as we come into the 1st century BC, one of the ways in which Julius Caesar tried to regularize his total power at the end of the civil wars was to get himself appointed dictator for life. It didn't work very well. It ruffled too many feathers. It shocked too many people's constitutional sensibilities, and that is one of the reasons why Julius Caesar was assassinated in the Senate House. And it was largely for that reason that when Augustus came to establishing his own absolute and unaccountable power, he ostentatiously resigned the office of dictator and instead constructed his power base from a bundle of other offices. But there was always the provision in Roman law for the appointment of a dictator in times of great emergency. And in 458 BC, Rome was suffering from a great emergency. So the Senate decided to appoint a dictator. After a debate in the Senate, it was decided that a man called Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, or Cincinnatus, should be appointed the dictator, and Cincinnatus was an elderly noble and an unfashionable, rather conservative politician. He did not have many friends in the ordinary course of Roman politics, but in this particular emergency it was decided that he was the only man who could be trusted to do what was necessary. So the Senate, after a debate, appointed Cincinnatus as the dictator. It was then necessary to go and find him and to tell him of his new office. But for a while nobody could find him. At last, a delegation from the Senate found him outside the walls of Rome, ploughing his fields. He wasn't sitting on a nice ebony and ivory chair watching slaves do the work for him. No, he was there with his toga hitched up, with his oxen, and he was yoking them and getting ready to plough his fields, no doubt assisted by other people, but that's what he was doing. The Senate told him, "You're now the dictator." They helped him into a clean toga and led him back into the city. Cincinnatus' first act on entering Rome was to walk into the forum and to conscript every able-bodied young man who came forward. With this new army that he'd raised by conscription, he went out in a series of battles. He defeated the enemy and took away all the immediate danger to Rome. His job was done. He walked back into the Senate after 15 days. He resigned his dictatorship and then went back to ploughing his fields. This is a story which we can take within the true area of Roman history, or within the substantially true area of early Roman history. It is sufficiently close to the Gallic Sack for it to be taken as a story based on reasonably verified facts. What does this show us? It shows us how the institution of dictatorship worked. It was an emergency office. It was not something outside the constitution, in the sense that every so often a European republic will break down, or a South American republic will break down, and a strong man will emerge to put things back together, who is somebody from outside the established system of government, who may do something halfway decent, or may turn out to be a blood-crazed mass murderer. It's very difficult to decide in advance. But the office of dictator was a part of the Roman constitution, not a regular part. You could have very long periods, whole generations going by without a dictator, but it was possible. But a dictator, once appointed, held absolute and unaccountable power. He could do anything he wanted. This story of Cincinnatus shows how Romans did behave when invested with this power. It also showed how they should behave when invested with this power. Cincinnatus held the power just as long as was needed to serve the purpose for which he'd been created dictator. This purpose having been served, he walked into the Senate and resigned his dictatorship after 15 days and walked back out of the city to continue ploughing his fields. So a probably true story, a possibly or a conceivably true story, but also a story which has a message. This is how Romans have behaved in the past, and this is how Romans should behave in the present and in the future. You must respect the laws, you must respect the fundamental laws of the state. If you're invested with great authority, you must use this in a manner suitable for the purpose for which it was given to you, and you must not hold this power for longer than has been granted, or longer than is necessary. You can see that this is a painting from 1806, at a time when the office of dictator was somewhat live in European history. You may also have noticed that there is an American state, Cincinnati, which is named after Cincinnatus. Something I haven't mentioned is that Roman history had an enormous influence on the creation of the American Republic at the end of the 18th century. In its outlines, the American Constitution is a regularization and an adaptation of British constitutional practice during the 18th century, where the king still exercised considerable executive powers, but the trappings of the American Constitution are not particularly English. They all have rather Roman names. You have senators, for example. You have the Capitol. You have all that Roman-style architecture in Washington. And you also have the state of Cincinnati. Roman Republican history, whether true or false, was very much in the minds of the founding fathers of the American Constitution. And the example of the breakdown of the Republic and its transformation into an empire was something with which the writers of the Federalist Papers continually grappled, and many of the key features of the American Constitution evolved or were created with the real or believed facts of Roman history in mind. Let's now look at another great Roman, Marcus Furius Camillus, who did exist, no doubt of that, 448 to 365 BC. He was a consul, and he was also a general in various wars between Rome and the Etruscan city-states, that is, the states to the north of Rome. Camillus is famous for two big sieges. He's also famous for chasing off the Gauls in the end when they sacked Rome. But the siege of Veii, this was a very large war. The Romans tried to take the Etruscan city of Veii. They tried between 405 and 396 BC. This was a big war. The city couldn't be taken by the Romans, and on one occasion Rome itself was endangered in this war. So Camillus was appointed dictator, given extraordinary powers. He used the powers for the purpose for which they had been granted, and then resigned them, of course. He took Veii eventually by supervising the construction of a set of tunnels which eventually led underneath the city and allowed the Roman army to break into the city without having to break through the walls. Then you have the capture of Falerii in 394 BC. That's just 4 years before the Gallic Sack, and so the broad outlines of the story can be taken as true history. What we know about this siege of Falerii is that it was a city on a hill. It was extremely difficult to take. At this time, siege warfare was not quite the science that it became as the 4th century progressed. The Romans couldn't take the city. All they could do was sit outside and starve it out, or wait until the people came out and started negotiations. But on one occasion, the citizens of Falerii were particularly disheartened by the progress of the war, so they sent out a delegation to negotiate a surrender. Camillus looked at their proposed terms of surrender and rejected them. He didn't reject them because they were insufficiently favourable to Rome. He rejected them because they were insufficiently favourable to the people of Falerii. He instead proposed his own terms of peace, which were considerably more favourable. The effect of this was that the Roman absorption of Falerii and of the surrounding territories was much easier than it would have been had the Romans marched in as a purely conquering army. And here we come to a story which illustrates the concern that Camillus had to behave in a fair manner at all times. It's a story which may not be true, but it's an interesting story. And here is a draft of the picture that I eventually decided on for the cover slide. This is the story of Camillus and the schoolmaster. This picture is not a great success because the schoolmaster doesn't simply look as if he's had a good beating. It looks as if he's been so badly beaten that his face has disintegrated, but never mind such things. 408, you have a Roman army besieging Falerii, this Etruscan city on a hill which is very hard to take, and the artificial intelligence engine has done a good job on this occasion at showing you Falerii. It's a very strongly defended city and it is on a hill. It is difficult to take. This is a siege, however, that went on for quite a long time, and there were people inside the walls of Falerii who thought, this has gone far enough, we need to do something. We can't make the Romans go away, so we'll have to come to some agreement with them. One of these people was a schoolmaster. In his class were the sons of all the leading citizens in Falerii. One day he had the idea of ending the siege by allowing the Romans to win. One morning he gathered up his class, he gathered up all his schoolboys and said, we're going for our morning exercise outside the walls. And although the city was under siege, it was not a tight blockade of the city. It was still possible to go out and wander about. The Romans were at some distance in their camp, and one might assume that they wouldn't pounce on a group of schoolboys doing their morning exercises. So the schoolteacher led his class out from the walls of Falerii into the countryside. The teacher then led them further and further away from the walls, all the way down into the Roman camp. He went up to Camillus and said, look, I've brought you these hostages. These are the sons of all the leading men in Falerii. All you need to do is take them under the walls and start cutting their throats one at a time, and by doing this and by threatening to cut all their throats, surely the gates will soon be opened. The teacher, having made his presentation, stood back, expecting at the very least a pat on the back and possibly a substantial reward. Instead, Camillus was outraged. He stood up and announced, I am a Roman. I fight wars with men, not with boys. And when we take this city, it will be by an exercise of Roman skill and courage. Camillus had the school teacher stripped naked, gave sticks to the boys, encouraged them to give him a good beating, and then to drive him back within the gates of the city. The people of Falerii, or at least the ruling class in Falerii, was so impressed by this exercise in moderation and fairness that it immediately sent a delegation to the Senate in Rome to say, you preferred honour in war to an immediate victory. We now voluntarily acknowledge your victory. And so this long and possibly embittered siege ended in a peaceful settlement in which the people of Falerii were absorbed into Roman dominion and became good friends and allies of the Romans, and in due course themselves became Roman citizens. Is this a true story? It might be. It's not that far away from the beginning of the established period in Roman history, or the period of Roman history for which we have reasonably established facts. But there is no reasonable doubt that Falerii was taken by the Romans on terms which were very fair to the Falerians, and that after that the Romans and the Falerians became very good friends and, as I said, in the fullness of time became the same people. And the story of Camillus and the schoolmaster is a conceivably true story. There is nothing out of the ordinary about it. There's nothing unrealistically heroic about it, as when Gaius Mucius Scaevola burnt his right hand off. This is something that you can easily imagine to have happened, and the Romans did similar things throughout their history, refusing to take advantage of a chance weakness by the enemy, insisting instead that they should behave with fairness and moderation in their ending of a war. We now have the Great Sack of Rome in 390 BC. The Mediterranean world has been subject to invasions from the non-temperate zones throughout the whole of recorded history. Indeed, it's been subject to invasions of this kind since long before the beginning of recorded history. Something to do with variations in global temperatures. Every so often, for whatever reason, it gets rather colder across the planet. At this point, people deep in Central Asia or in the far north of Europe, who've spent generations or centuries happily wandering around their established grounds, their established territories as hunter-gatherers, suddenly find that the pickings in those territories are no longer adequate for their needs. At this time, they gather their possessions and their farm animals together and begin a slow trek towards the more temperate zones. Sometimes they've heard stories about this warm sea surrounded by almost undefended cities where the women are all very beautiful and the men behave like women, and where these territories are there for the taking. And then you will have a gathering movement of peoples from the colder zones into the Mediterranean area. And one such incursion came at the end of the 5th century, the beginning of the 4th century, when the Gauls, who were already established in northern Italy, but when another tribe of Gauls came from beyond the Alps. At first, this was a matter for the independent or the autonomous or the semi-autonomous cities in the north of Italy. The Romans didn't take a very close interest in this. It was a matter for the northern cities to deal with. If the Romans needed to come to the support of any allies, they would consider that in due course. The Romans themselves were fighting wars in the south or the centre of Italy, and they paid very little attention to this Gallic incursion. However, the northern cities collapsed one after the other. They fell almost at the first appearance of the Gauls. The Gauls moved deeper and deeper into Italy until a large Gallic army appeared out of nowhere before the gates of Rome. The walls of Rome were not in very good repair, the city was indefensible, and there was no army for defending the city, and all the fighting men were off in the army elsewhere. Rome fell. A number of interesting stories. The main story is that although the Gauls took and burned the lower parts of the city, a defence force held out on the Capitoline Hill. The Gauls tried to take that without success, but as the Romans were withdrawing to the Capitol Hill, the old men in the city, and particularly the senators, said, "Look, we're too old to fight, we're too old to be of use in the defence of the capital, but we shall eat just as much food as everybody else and drink just as much water, and we know that these will be in short supply. We won't come with you. What we will do is we'll stay at home and take whatever these barbarians dish out to us." One story is that the senators all gathered together in the Senate House. They sat on their chairs of ivory, very still, holding their ivory and ebony staffs. The Gauls poked their noses into the Senate House And at first, they thought they were looking at a collection of very lifelike statues, until one of the Gauls went a little too close to an elderly senator with a very fine beard. He reached a hand forward and tugged on the beard to see if it was real or of stone. At this point, the senator lost his temper, reached forward with his ivory staff, and struck the Gaul on the head. And that was the beginning of a general massacre of the senators. They voluntarily gave up their lives for the security of the remaining Roman people. A true story? Possibly. It's in 390, right at the beginning of Roman history based on facts that we can reasonably trust. It may be a true story, it may be an exaggeration, but again, it's a story that was told to generation after generation of schoolboys. Your primary duty is to the Roman state, not to your own safety. Now this picture on the right of the slide, the Gauls could not get into the capital. It was too securely defended. And so one night they decided to mount a stealth attack. They climbed up a side of the Capitoline hill that the Romans thought was particularly impassable. Everyone was asleep, the guards were paying very little attention, and the Gauls climbed further and further up. At last, as the first Gauls reached the topmost walls and were about to jump over and start the massacre, the sacred geese on top of the Capitoline hill, the geese that were sacred to Jupiter Capitolinus, saw the Gauls and began cackling very loudly. The Romans woke up, they took up arms, and they fought off the Gauls. They threw them back over the walls. They broke the attack. At last, however, the Romans realised that they couldn't hold out for very much longer, and so they sent a delegation down to deal with the Gauls, and the Gallic leader was a man called Brennus. Brennus declared that he would leave what remained of Rome for payment of a very, very large sum of gold. The Romans found this sum, and they began to weigh it with the Gauls. They then realised that the Gauls were using false weights. The Gauls were demanding a much greater weight of gold than they'd specified because the scales they were using were all bent. When the Romans pointed this out to Brennus, he laughed and apparently said to them, "Oh, vae victis, woe to the conquered. Tough luck, you've lost. You play by our rules from now on." The Romans had no particular choice until suddenly the Roman army arrived back, led by Camillus. There was a great battle, the Gauls were defeated, and they were driven off. Now this, in its outlines, is true history. This is what happened. The Romans went back into their city, which was burned and plundered, and it was necessary to start all over again. This was a short-term setback for the Romans. They very quickly re-established their pattern of alliances and dominions through central Italy. The Gallic invasion, though, was a very important event in Roman history, not simply because it apparently led to the destruction of all the records for early Roman history, but also because it told the Romans that if they really wanted to be safe, it was not enough to exercise a loose dominion over large parts of central Italy, to have an alliance of friendship with this particular state, to have actual control over this state, to be on friendly terms with this state, and so on. What the Romans needed in order to protect themselves from any future incursion of this kind was to establish total Roman control over the whole of Italy. And this is what the Romans did progressively during the next 100 years. This is what led not only to the Roman takeover of the Latin-speaking areas of central Italy, not even the takeover of the areas in central Italy where people spoke a language that was reasonably close to Latin. It meant the reduction of the Etruscan states in the north to Roman dominion. So the Romans spread their authority throughout the whole of northern Italy. For the most part, this was not resisted by those peoples because they realized that the only way that Italy could be kept safe from an enemy coming at them from across the Alps was to have one very strong power which would be able to protect the whole of Italy. But during this century, during the 4th century, the Romans spread their control from central Italy deep into northern Italy, establishing a new border along the River Po. North of that, it is nowadays called Italy, and after the death of Julius Caesar, it was formally incorporated into Italy. But until the time of Julius Caesar, Gaul did not start beyond the Alps. Gaul started north of the River Po, and the Romans established their dominion over the whole of central and northern Italy south of the River Po. Now, because the Romans are seriously interested now in taking over the whole of Italy as a matter of self-defence, and because the Romans were often welcomed in large parts of Italy because they were seen as protectors, it meant the Romans now had to turn their attention to the south of Italy. And let's look at the situation in the south. Notice these rather beigey areas in the south, places with cities like Neapolis, Salernum, Paestum, Metapontum, Tarentum, Brundisium, Croton, Locri, Rhegium, and so on. These were areas settled, or at least these were areas largely settled and controlled, not by people who counted as Italians. They didn't speak a language similar to Latin, or rather they did speak a language similar to Latin, but it was not an Italian language. They also didn't speak a language similar at all to Etruscan. These were Greeks. There is a map of the various Greek settlements throughout the Mediterranean world that were established after about 700 BC. Greece itself is a rather stony, rather arid country for the most part. It has always supported a limited population. For that reason, throughout their long history, the Greeks have always tended to drift away from the main territory of Greece to live in other places. In the Mediterranean world, after about 700 BC, Greek settlers, Greek colonists, set out from the territory of what is now Greece to establish new settlements elsewhere. They established settlements all around the Black Sea. They established settlements, well, these settlements were established deep into the Bronze Age, along the western coast, the western and southern coasts of what is now Turkey. The Greeks settled the coastal areas of North Africa to the west of Egypt, their main city in North Africa being Cyrene. The Greeks settled areas of southern France and of eastern Spain. Marseille is in its origin a Greek city. But the main area of Greek settlement outside Greece was southern Italy. At a very early period, the Greeks took over most of Sicily and virtually the whole of southern Italy. And these Greek areas were very wealthy and very populous. Cities like Syracuse, they were at least as large as the main Greek cities of Athens and Corinth and Ephesus. And indeed, if you look a little further north, you have the city of Sybaris, from which we get the word Sybarite, somebody who is excessively devoted to luxury, because the people of this city were notoriously wealthy and luxurious in their personal habits. The Romans had known about the Greeks from very early in their history. The Romans had obviously been heavily influenced by the Greeks from the very earliest times, influenced by the Etruscans, of course, but also influenced by the Greeks. The Romans had traded with the Greeks, the Romans had fought wars with the Greeks, the Romans had made occasional treaties with some of the Greek cities in southern Italy. But now part of the Roman project of securing themselves from any danger within Italy by conquering the whole of Italy brought them into progressive conflict with these large and wealthy and potentially hostile Greek cities in the south. Here we need to look a little further away than Italy. This map shows the empire conquered by Alexander the Great. In the 330s and the 320s BC, Alexander led an army from a Greece that his father, Philip of Macedon, had united. He led it from Europe into Asia. The original purpose, as I understand it, was simply to liberate the Greek cities on the coast of what is now Turkey from Persian control. But in 3 big battles, Alexander defeated, first of all, a large Persian army, which gave him the whole of what is now Western Turkey. He then fought a battle against the king of Persia, which was a shattering victory for him, which gave him control over the whole of the western part of the Persian Empire. He then won a final battle over the king of Persia, which gave him control of the whole Persian Empire, which he then took over. He became the great king of Persia, and he then set about expanding that empire deep into India and up into Central Asia. Alexander died at a very early age in Babylon in 323 BC, and as soon as he was dead, his empire was partitioned among his generals. This led to about 250 years of endemic warfare in this new Greek world between the successor kingdoms, and here are 3 of the big men in the generation after the death of Alexander the Great. There on the top left you have Ptolemy I, who was an old school friend of Alexander and one of his most trusted generals. He eventually became Pharaoh of Egypt, and he founded a line that would continue to rule Egypt until the time of Cleopatra. There, that rather silvery statue is Seleucus I, who took over the entire eastern area of Alexander's empire, Syria, and all of those areas going down to the Arabian Sea, down to the Indian Ocean, and so on. And Antigonus I, who took over most of the territory of Macedon and of Greece. These were the great powers in the Mediterranean world in the 3rd and the beginning of the 2nd centuries BC. Since I have the map open, I might as well point out as well that one of the reasons why the Gauls didn't come back into Italy after 390, one of the reasons why, although the Romans were rather frightened of a fresh Gallic incursion, there was no fresh Gallic incursion, was because Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander spent a lot of their time not necessarily conquering the whole of Greece and getting ready for a conquest in Asia. They spent a lot of their time fighting along and beyond the Danubian frontiers of the Kingdom of Macedon. They inflicted a number of decisive defeats on the Celtic barbarians who lived beyond the Danube, And this had the purpose of taking a lot of the pressure off the Mediterranean world for a while. Eventually the Celts came back for second helpings, but by then the Romans were ready to take up the job of defending the Mediterranean world. But one of the reasons why the Romans didn't suffer another Gallic invasion was because of the work done by Philip of Macedon to secure the Danubian frontiers of Macedon. As I said, that had the effect of taking pressure off the rest of the Mediterranean world. So you have these Greek settlements in southern Italy. You have a Roman project, because you can now talk about a Roman project, of conquering the whole of Italy. This necessarily brought the Romans into conflict with the Greek cities and the Greek states in southern Italy. In themselves, these Greek states were not really up to fighting off the Romans. The Romans, by now, were the strongest military power in Italy. Nobody, unless he was seriously deranged, thought it was a good idea to lead an army against the Romans because he would lose. Everybody knew that. If the Romans turn up, you negotiate with them, you appeal to their better nature, and the Romans did have a better nature on occasion. Whatever the case, you do not get involved in an all-out war with them because you will lose. But the city of Taranto in southern Italy was not willing to accept Roman dominion. The city of Taranto did not have adequate forces to defend itself against the Romans, but you have these enormously large and powerful Greek states throughout the eastern Mediterranean world. There was no help from Egypt, the richest and most powerful of the successor states of Alexander, because the Ptolemies were rather pacific in their western Mediterranean policy. They kept an eye on the western Mediterranean. They became aware of Roman expansion at a very early period and established immediate, long-term good relations with the Romans. So when the people of Taranto sent envoys to Ptolemy in Alexandria saying, would you send an army for our defence? We'll see that you're well rewarded. And Ptolemy sent them away with a flea in their ear. And this happened through most of the Greek world. Either these Greek rulers were not interested in getting into a conflict with the Romans, or they were otherwise engaged. But there was one man in the Greek world, a man called Pyrrhus. He was the king of Epirus, eastern Greece. He made an agreement with Taranto and some of the other Greek cities in southern Italy. He would turn up with a large army. He would be the head of a mercenary band employed by some of the Greek cities in southern Italy, and he would defend the Greek states in southern Italy against the attempted conquest by Rome. You know, I don't seem to have the slide that I made on the Pyrrhic Wars. I'll have to put that in at some point. So what I'll do is I'll show you this map of the Mediterranean world showing the Greek settlements, and I'll just talk you through it. Sorry about that, but I was making up these slides last night and I thought I was duplicating and overwriting the duplicates, but I just wiped out the Pyrrhus ones. Pyrrhus turned up in southern Italy in the 270s BC. At first, he inflicted a number of large defeats on the Romans. The Greeks who were paying for his defence were delighted with the service he was rendering them. The Romans came against him, expecting they'd roll over him just as they'd rolled over all their other enemies in Italy, and instead Pyrrhus inflicted a number of serious defeats on the Romans. However, the Romans were not put off by this. A number of things we said. The first is that when the Romans were defeated by Pyrrhus, they didn't simply pull back into central Italy and say, oh, we've bitten off more than we can chew, we'll leave the Greeks alone. No, the Romans simply put together another army and marched back into southern Italy. The second thing to say is that although Pyrrhus did inflict a number of serious defeats on the Romans, his own losses were catastrophically large. And from that we get the expression a Pyrrhic victory. You win something, you win a battle, you win a war, you win a contest with somebody, but the cost of winning that contest is so great that you are unable to reap any benefits from it. In the end, the best he won was a Pyrrhic victory. That is, you win on points, but you're unable to benefit from your victory. Eventually, Pyrrhus realised that this war, in which he'd undertaken to defend the Italian city-states, the Greek-Italian city-states from the Romans, was unsustainable. It didn't matter how much money he was paid by these people, he just couldn't raise the numbers of men needed to defeat the Romans, and he realised by looking at Roman tactics and Roman strategies that he would eventually lose. So he made an agreement with the Romans and withdrew, leaving those Greek city-states in southern Italy completely without defence. And so very, very quickly the Romans marched into the whole of southern Italy and reduced the Greek cities one after another to various degrees of subjection to Roman control. This is an important event in Roman history. It's an important event because it completed the Roman takeover of the whole of Italy. It's also important because for the first time it brought the Romans into close and continuous communication with the Greeks. And the Roman encounter with Greece is one of the most significant facts in Roman history. It is a fact so significant that we are still living with its consequences. But I'll say more about that another time. What else I would say about the Romans is that they were not ungenerous with their settlement of southern Italy. They allowed the Greek cities to carry on much as before. They were now allies of the Roman people. They would provide contingents of fighting men as and when required. They would conduct their diplomatic relations under the directions of Rome, but otherwise they were allowed to manage their own affairs in much the same way as they always had. And so Rome is now in total control of Italy. And for a while, all went well. This is a somewhat exaggerated illustration that I called for last night from my artificial intelligence engine. I wanted an idyllic scene in Roman history from the 3rd century BC of a man ploughing his fields surrounded by his happy wife and children. I didn't expect that what I'd be given would look like a rather old-fashioned advertisement for butter, but never mind. This is perhaps an exaggeration of the situation in Italy after the Roman conquest, but it's probably not a very great exaggeration. Italy at this time was a land filled with small peasant farmers. These were farmers who owned and farmed a piece of ancestral land, a small piece of ancestral land. These people drew their living from the land that they farmed, and they had secure control, they had secure possession of their land. There were rich people in Italy, some senators were rather rich, but for the most part the Roman and the Italian upper classes were richer than other people only in the sense that they had rather larger farms or they had rather nicer houses in the cities. Italy was a land predominantly of small-scale peasant farmers, Most of the cities, and certainly Rome in itself, were rather small, unassuming places. They were places where people went in from the countryside for administrative purposes or for purposes of consumption. You had no very large cities in the Latin-speaking areas of Italy. You can't say that everybody was free and equal. Yes, you had slaves. Yes, you had people who were reduced to something like slavery by debt or by other unfortunate circumstances. And you did have divisions between rich and poor. But for the most part, there was a rather rough equality of circumstances between most of the people in Italy. And Italy was, for the most part, a land of peace. However, this is a map of the Western Mediterranean in 264 BC. You see that the Roman Republic has now expanded and that it controls the whole of Italy. It controls the whole of Italy and nothing more. Rome is not a naval power. Rome is not a commercial power. Rome is interested in the control of Italy, and this is something that the Romans have achieved. There is, however, another great power in the Western Mediterranean. This is the grey area based on this city in North Africa, Carthage. This is also a republic that appears to have been established about the same time as the Roman Republic. Unlike the Roman Republic, Carthage is a naval power, it is a commercial power. Because Carthage is interested in trade and the sea, and the Romans are interested in Italy, there is no reason why Carthage and Rome cannot peacefully coexist within the Western Mediterranean, and that is what they did for many centuries. The Romans and the Carthaginians had been in a state of peace and reasonable friendship for many centuries. However, there were Greek cities not only in southern Italy, but all through Sicily, and the Carthaginians had an interest in Sicily. It was rather close to Carthage, it was wealthy, and the Greek city-states were not really up to defending themselves. The Carthaginians gobbled up more and more of Sicily until they took Messina. And if you ever go to Messina, I did some years ago with my wife, you can stand on the hill above Messina and you can look across a few miles of water to the Italian mainland. And by 264, the Romans and the Carthaginians could look at each other across that very narrow strip of water. And the Romans, although the Romans themselves had no particular interest in what happened in Sicily, this was one of the two Western Mediterranean superpowers that was very, very close to Italy. And the Romans were now listening to their new Greek subjects and friends, and those Greeks didn't like the Etruscans. They'd rather looked down on the Romans, but they accepted the Romans as a semi-kindred people. Greek and Latin are very similar languages. The Greeks and Romans worshipped the same gods. The Greeks and Romans, when they weren't fighting each other or sneering at each other, generally got on extremely well. And the Greeks were telling the Romans, you look out, those Carthaginians are bad people. They've made life difficult for us in the Western Mediterranean. They have driven all Greek trading ships from the Western Mediterranean. They've closed it. They've closed the entire West Mediterranean to Greek shipping. They are gobbling up Greek settlements all through the Western Mediterranean. We don't like the Carthaginians. They're beastly people. They don't speak a language that's at all similar to Greek or Latin. Their social and political ways are radically different from our own. And look, they're just across the water now in Sicily. You mark my words, if you don't pay careful attention now, those Carthaginians will do to southern Italy what they've done to Sicily. The Romans didn't listen to that at first, but of course if you keep on saying it year after year to the Romans, perhaps the Romans will eventually grow rather suspicious of Carthage, and the Carthaginians themselves will grow rather suspicious of the Romans. And so this long period of peace and prosperity in a united Italy will not last for very much longer. But I think I've gone right up to the limit again. I do apologise. And I didn't even get to show the Pyrrhus slide, which I will try to put in. But that broadly covers the Roman conquest of Italy and the emergence of Rome as a great power in the Western Mediterranean. And next week, I want to talk about the beginning of the long period of hostility between Rome and Carthage. But does anybody have any questions about what I've said today?